Norris, professor of marketing and psychology at Berea College in Kentucky, is back on Brand Outlaw podcast. Ian, how you been?
Good. It's fun to be back and talk about something a little bit different.
Yeah, good to have you back. And now, here's what I want to talk about today. Let me start by quoting great philosopher and NASCAR driver Ricky Bobby. If you ain't first, you're last. Is that correct? I don't know. We're applying this to brands today. Is it so bad to be in second place? Because I feel like we kind of default to talking about the number one brands when we're giving examples of success stories. Coca-Cola, McDonald's, Apple, but we can learn a lot from looking at who's right behind them as well. So that's what we want to talk about today. Second place brands. Is it so bad being in second place? What are your general thoughts on this topic?
Well, we're both athletes, so first thing that came to my mind was second place is first loser, right?
Yeah, exactly. So maybe it depends on the context.
Well, marketers have kind of put themselves in this corner, right? Because if you think like a number two, you're thinking like a number two really only because you're trying to be number one.
Right.
Right. If you think about yourself a different way, right? Maybe you're not a number two. Maybe you're a number one in a different capacity, right? Or maybe you're not a number two because number two is not the right metric to use to evaluate your success as a brand. Mm-hmm. I've been thinking about this for a little while since you told me that this was going to be the topic, and I came up with a model.
Okay.
And you're just hearing this for the first time, so We're going to try to do this live. I looked at some examples of number two brands, one we've talked about, others that I've thought of since then, and tried to put them into categories, strategically speaking. And so here's what I came up with. And what we can do is we can try to figure out which of these number twos are finding success with each of these strategies. Now, I only actually came up with examples for two of the categories, but I'm certain there's something that works for my third one because it's a great strategy and it's got to work for somebody somewhere. So here it is. You ready?
Okay. This sounds good. And by the way, I'm hearing this for the first time. Ian has not shared this with me ahead of time, so I'm really excited about this.
That's right. And I am not a number two brand strategy consultant, right? So somebody may have done this research and there might be a model out there. This is my armchair theory.
Okay.
So we're testing it live right now on Brand Outlaw. Here it goes.
We'll do it live.
Differentiate, authenticate, or repudiate.
Okay.
So if you're a number two, you have three choices. Differentiate, authenticate, or repudiate. Okay, here's what I mean by that. So the first strategy is the most obvious strategy. We're going to find lots of examples of that once we get in here and start talking. Maybe it's a question of why you're better than the number one, but more likely it's just a question of who are you and why should people care, right? If you're number one, everybody knows who you are and people already care. Right. So the question for a number two, if you're using a differentiation strategy, is how can you convince people that you have a different kind of value that's worth paying attention to? And one of the things that's interesting is when I started to dig into the marketing strategies for the sort of obvious number twos, like Burger King and Pepsi, and another one I thought of, a classic sort of head-to-head story from the 1980s, much like Coke and Pepsi, Miller Lite.
Good one. Yeah.
Is a real focus on differentiation in some way. So that's the obvious one. Maybe less obviously is what I'm calling an authenticate. So an authenticity strategy. A differentiation strategy is a strategy that's sort of designed to go head to head and maybe ultimately become number one, right? Let's show people why we matter and ultimately show people why we're better. But maybe a different strategy, and there's an amazing historical precedent for this, and we're going to take a look at it, right?
Okay.
is to embrace being number two. To show people why being number two is actually better.
Okay.
And then the third one, I know that there's examples of this out there. Right?
Yeah.
We're going to have to figure out what they are. But it had to rhyme with differentiate and authenticate, right?
I like that.
Repudiate. So we're going to reject the competition, right? We're just going to walk away and do our own thing.
You mean like pretend they don't exist?
We could be pretending they don't exist, or really I was thinking of, maybe we're going to step out of that competitive space altogether.
Okay.
So it's one step removed from an authenticity strategy, I think, because in a differentiate framework, you're still like thinking in terms of number one, number two. Here's the market leader. Here's who we are. Here's how we're different because we want to be number one. In an authenticity strategy, we're going to kind of take ownership of our number two status and show why it's okay, or maybe why it's even better to be a number two. But we're going to go one step further with this repudiate strategy and just step away from the competition, right? We're just going to go our own way. We don't care about who our competitors are. Maybe we want to redefine the market, right? Maybe we want to establish a new product category, a new competitive landscape. Maybe this is like, it occurred to me that maybe this is a blue ocean strategy. If you're familiar with blue ocean strategy, that's something that we could talk about, right?
Yeah.
So if you're, classic example, if you're Southwest Airlines and you want to compete in that industry, which is a notoriously hard industry to compete in, where are you going to be relative to the big dominant players in that industry, long-standing competition from United, American, and Delta? Well, you're not, right? You're going to go a different path altogether. You're going to exploit a market in that industry that maybe isn't being served at all. Maybe you're creating a new market for an existing product in the process. So that's a lot. I'll shut up for a minute, and then maybe we go back through this and start talking about where our number twos might fit.
Yeah. A little bit more on Blue Ocean, if you're wondering what that is. We wrote an article about this on thebrandoutlaw.com. The analogy is your competition are sharks. Do you want to swim with the sharks? That means you're swimming in a red ocean, red being blood, of course. Do you want to be fighting with all these other sharks for the scraps of the fish that they're trying to eat? Or do you want to swim in a blue ocean where no one else is swimming and you're, by default, the market leader? That's it in a nutshell. So, okay, I got what you're saying. And it sounds like, and then going back to another article we just put out on challenger brands, and just to distinguish that a challenger brand is not necessarily the second place brand. It's someone who's actively going after the competition, and second place brands aren't necessarily challenger brands either. They might be happy with their spot. So it sounds like your first strategy, differentiate, that's the challenger brand one.
I think that would be pretty fair to say. Yeah. At least explicitly it's a challenger brand strategy, right? If you're using an authenticity strategy and embracing your number two status, that could certainly work in your favor.
Yeah. Okay. And so I think we can come up with a lot of examples of brands that are doing the differentiation. Let's talk about authentication. What are some examples of brands that have done that with success?
Well, we'll have to go to one of the most iconic ad campaigns of all time, a little bit of a history lesson. What some people say is the most classic advertising campaign in history, certainly one of the most iconic. This comes from a dominant Madison Avenue firm in the early 1960s. Some people have said it's the firm that the show Mad Men was loosely based on. They had a lot of iconic campaigns, but this being one of the more iconic ones. Avis had approached them specifically with this problem of being a number two brand in this industry, and being a number two brand for a long time. They were sort of the upstart in an industry that was basically created by the Hertz rent-a-car industry, as it was called back then. They came to DD&B with this problem. We've been stuck in this number 2 spot for a long time, and we like to do something about it. And the solution that the agency brought back to them was show why being number 2 is better. Let's tell your customers why being number 2 makes Avis better than Hertz. Brilliant strategy. A number of different ways you can go about this, particularly when you look at what the more well-trodden path is of differentiation.
Yeah, and had that been done before?
It seems to me that to be that.
Yeah.
Sure. Maybe we could find some historical precedents, but in terms of cultural history, this is the one that people know. This is the one that stands out.
Yeah.
And you can see right away how they're able to. So I guess you could say that more broadly speaking, it's a great example of how companies can take weaknesses, potential weaknesses, and turn them into strengths. But in this capacity, from purely the perspective of marketing communications, you can, without changing anything at all, right? Yeah. Making this part of your communication strategy, something that I think is quite new at the time and certainly innovative. You could also argue bold and courageous and risky. And
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're talking like 50 years before transparency and authenticity were these cliche buzzwords we're using all the time. And we love when brands are transparent and all that. In the 60s, everyone was saying, we're the leading brand, 5 out of 5 doctors recommend our cigarettes, that kind of stuff. So for them to say, we're not number 1, that was a really bold move, and it paid off. I mean, the design of that ad is nothing fantastic. And the tagline, you can, it's just blending in with the copy. So, but ignoring that dated looking design, I mean, that is a fantastic tagline. We try harder.
Yeah. When you start to go back and look at ads from this era, the copy is so important, right? It's the text elements are as important, probably more important than the visuals in a lot of cases.
Yeah.
During this era. And that makes sense because it was a lot of print advertising, right? A lot of magazines in particular. Our channels of communication have changed, and they're channels that are a lot more visually heavy and attention limited channels, but you'll see that across the board when you look at ads from that era. The tagline became "We try harder," right? So why is number 2 not a bad place to be? Because we can't afford to sleep on the job. We can't afford to rest. We can't afford to not be the best, right? We're better because we're number 2. It's just a brilliant strategy. It was enormously successful. So there's a whole line of ads in this campaign. You can go look them up. There's one that has to do with service. So you're going to get better service. You're going to get treated better as a customer. Our cars are going to be cleaner. They poked fun at Hertz by making it look like Hertz was renting outdated and worn out automobiles. Our fleet is brand new. Our cars are spotless. Our service team is going to give you the best possible service experience. Why do we do all these things? Because, well, implicitly, maybe they're saying we're trying to be number 1. That's sort of the subtext. But they're telling you that by communicating what's so good about being second place. It's just, it's a brilliant strategy, I think. And it had the effect of, well, not ever putting them ahead of Hertz, closing the gap significantly. So I looked up some data on this campaign. In 1962, Hertz had about 60% market share and Avis had about 30%. So, and I guess the rest of the market had the scraps. They were swimming with sharks, right?
Yeah.
And so the 2-to-1 market share ratio, 6 years later, that gap had closed to about 49-36. So about a 13 percentage point gap. They basically cut the gap by more than half. Now, if you add up the numbers, it looked like some of those third and beyond brands ate into that market share a little bit. Makes me wonder if maybe this campaign was ultimately more damaging to Hertz than it was beneficial to Avis, right?
Yeah.
Because Hertz loses more market share as a result of this, and Avis gains if you take a look at the numbers. But,
yeah, true.
Telling your customers that number 2 is better might put you on a path to being number 1.
Yeah, I like it. They don't have to hide anything. They don't have to convince you of anything other than kind of changing your mindset of, why go with the leading brand all the time? Why default to that?
Yeah.
Can you think of other brands that take this approach?
Yeah, I can. Thanks to you. When we talked initially,
okay, yeah,
you said we're going to talk about 3 brands. You said Burger King, Pepsi, and Megadeth.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
now I hope your listeners know who Megadeth is. If they don't, they should.
Yes, absolutely. Just if you have to pause this episode and look up Megadeth on Spotify, go ahead, then come back and listen. Let's start with the Pepsi and the Burger King right now. What are some things that they have done? How does it fit into your model, first of all?
Definitely differentiated.
Yeah, that's what I would say.
Even right down to the present day, like you still see this dynamic at work. So right now, and these companies are often changing their positioning statements and their taglines, but right now McDonald's is. I just had it. I might have to look it up real quick. Burger King is having your way, right?
It's still, I'm loving it.
I'm loving it. That's it. Okay. I looked at several of these 1-2 sort of, classic head-to-head competitors in consumer markets over the last couple of decades, and I saw this dynamic over and over again. The number one's not really telling you anything about who they are and what they do.
They're more tapping into the feeling that they want you to have.
Sure, something more symbolic or experiential about the connections that you might have with the brand. Maybe that's both a cause and a consequence. When you have a brand that's so powerful and enduring, you actually have the luxury of the ability to capitalize on all that brand equity. It's also the case that if you're the number 2 and maybe you don't have that kind of history or brand symbolism, you have to take a different approach. And the approach that you always see is, like we said, differentiation. You have to tell people, how are you not McDonald's in a way that is better than McDonald's? Have it your way, right? So McDonald's is enduring and unchanging, and that's where they derive all this cultural brand history that creates such incredible value for them. But, that's not very flexible, right? That's right. McDonald's is the same thing for eternity, for everyone, everywhere, all over the world, right? I'm probably taking this way too far, but you can almost see the strategy at work when you're Burger King and you're trying to differentiate from the perspective of branding and in a way that kind of turns that on its head, right? Burger King is not about the enduring, unchanging, symbolic brand. It's about who you are and what you want. I thought that was kind of an interesting dynamic at work.
Yeah. And as I was just looking up Burger King tagline, I didn't even see this until just a few seconds ago, but it looks like they're going to be rolling out another one later this year. It's going to be called You Rule.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah. But again, they're still sticking with that. It's about you, the customer, and flexibility, I guess, is what they're trying to say.
You can't compete with the monumental, iconic McDonald's brand, right? So don't even try. If it's McDonald's, it's all about McDonald's. If it's Burger King, well, there is no iconic, enduring, unchanging, symbolic brand value to Burger King, not in a way that can compete with McDonald's. So let's, I guess, say what's good about that. That means there's more flexibility, more room for you to be you, because there's less room for sort of us to be us, like McDonald's.
Yeah.
It's all about you. Like if it's McDonald's, it's all about us, right?
Yeah. And I see Pepsi kind of doing something similar. They've always tried to be that alternative to the longstanding iconic brand. They were the taste of a new generation.
Yeah.
And now they're even rolling out. Have you seen the Pepsi rebrand, like what they're going to be rolling out later this year?
Not what's coming down the road.
Okay, so they're finally getting away from that thin lowercase word mark with the, twisty smile thing.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, the logo looks a lot like the classic, 3 waves, says Pepsi inside. It's tweaked, it's more modernized. So they're going back to that. And it's a much bolder look than they've had for the past 15 years. Mm-hmm. But they're also having a heavier focus on their sugar-free drinks, as if they were trying to position themselves as a healthier alternative to Coke.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And the science, but that's debatable whether a sugar-free soda is actually healthy at all. But that's a different topic. We're just talking about the branding.
What's interesting about that strategy to me is it's pretty consistent with the way that they've done their branding and positioning for decades. They're still looking for that younger consumer that's different than the stodgy, conservative, long-time brand loyal Coke consumer. Right. So in the 80s, they were the choice of a new generation. Maybe they still are in a way. We're talking about different consumers and different products, but we know that younger consumers in particular are going to be kind of the leading edge on healthier, more sustainable consumer packaged foods. Mm-hmm. When I look especially back at the iconic Coke and Pepsi wars, or McDonald's Burger King wars, or I'll throw a third one in there for you now too, Bud Light versus Miller Lite. The same kind of theme runs all the way through. It's Coke and it's McDonald's and it's Bud Light telling you more about what's so great about being who we are. And their number twos, their competitors, having to find other ways of communicating brand value to consumers, often highlighting through differentiation the unique features, the unique product features that differentiate them from the brand kings, right? So Pepsi does the taste test challenge, right? Coke for decades is just banking on their brand equity, just like we talked about with McDonald's. It's not about our product. It's about good feelings and American tradition and the holidays, right? It's about going to grandma's house for Christmas, right? Pepsi is here to tell you that it is about the product and ours is better, right? Here's the taste test challenge. Burger King is doing the same thing, emphasizing the fact that their burgers are flame broiled, right? Highlighting product features. Maybe they're telling you something that you don't want to know about the way that McDonald's burgers are produced. I don't know, but Burger King's are flame broiled. It's not fast food at all, right? You may as well be in your backyard cooking these on the grill yourself. Highlighting product features. And of course, as almost everybody's going to remember, if they're like anywhere's in the neighborhood of our age, Miller Lite's famous tastes great, less filling. Mm-hmm. We're going to take the emphasis away from the brand and put the emphasis on the product. It is about the product. Our product's better because you get more taste for fewer calories. And just like we saw with Coca-Cola and with McDonald's, you're going to see Bud Light utilizing a strategy that has very little to do with their product and more to do with their brand. You probably remember the give me a light, no a Bud Light ads from the 1980s, right? Bring out like a lamp or a flashing neon light or whatever. It's not even about the product, right? It's just kind of a silly play on the brand name. And Miller can't afford to do that because they don't have the brand equity. They have to make it about the product.
What are your thoughts about directly calling out your competition? If you're in second place and just, even if you're not calling them out by name, but just running an ad or some kind of tagline where it's like, you know what they're saying. Like, Burger King saying McDonald's sucks, come to us. What do you think about that? Because it seems like if you're in first place, the move is just completely ignore your competition. Don't even mention them, because then you're admitting that you see them as a threat. But what if it's reversed? If you're in second place, do you call out the top dog?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think if you do, you have to be careful, because if they're number one, they're probably anxious for litigation.
Good point. Yeah.
And there's a rule. The FTC says that you can say whatever you want about your competitor as long as you can prove that it's true.
Right.
And there's this classic case from the 1990s where Papa John's was making claims about the having the freshest ingredients of any of the fast food pizza restaurants. I can't remember if they called out any of their competitors directly, but I do know, and some of you all might remember, that their tagline used to be fresher ingredients every day, something along those lines.
Okay.
They had to change it to better ingredients because Pizza Hut sued them. And my recollection of this is that they somehow implicated Pizza Hut in their marketing. And maybe they mentioned them by name. Maybe they didn't. But like you said, like, you know who they're talking about.
Yeah.
Right? Something they said, the Pizza Hut executives interpreted as they're trying to say that their ingredients are fresher than ours. And it's not true. And they sued Papa John's. And they won. And so Papa John's can't say that anymore, which is why they say better, but not fresher.
We're cool with you saying you're better than us, just not fresher. That's too far. But I understand that you can measure freshness more than better. Better is subjective.
There you go. That's how, right? So it's, if you make a claim, you have to be able to substantiate it, and you can risk. It's a risky strategy if you can't. I don't know if that cost Papa John's market share, but it definitely cost them real money.
I do wonder if there's a risk, though, of pushing back against the competition. If you go too far, you're risking pissing off their customer base rather than getting some of those loyal customers say, maybe I'll give this one a try.
Yeah, I think it might come down to whether you are trying to steal customers away or whether you're trying to recruit new customers. If you're trying to recruit new customers to the product category, then maybe there's not a lot of limits on how far you should be willing to go to take down number one. If you're counting on taking their customers away, I think it's a much riskier strategy because consumers might retrench and actually develop greater loyalty in order to defend their own brand loyalty against this upstart competitor. I think it's a good point.
Another advantage I see of being in second place is you have a little more room for innovation, right? I mean, you can stay ahead of the curve and just be a little more nimble, be an early adopter for some things when you don't have the number one spot on the line. Do you agree?
I think that's an excellent point. Being number one kind of puts you in a defensive position because you're constantly having to look behind you at who's coming and how fast. I mean, good companies, even when they're market leaders, continually innovate and stay out of that trap of being pushed into a defensive position. But it's a risk that number twos are much less likely to have to face. I think Apple, you mentioned earlier, is a great example of a company that maintains a dominant market position without having to spend a whole lot of time looking over their shoulder. They know that everybody's going to follow their lead. But if you're not Apple, if your brand equity doesn't derive from innovativeness, I can see that you're in a much more vulnerable position as a number one. Every move you make is a little bit riskier. If you're number one and the competition is fierce, maybe the market's pretty well saturated by that point. Maybe we're talking about a late growth, early maturity product. That means that a lot of it is zero sum in terms of any customer I lose is going to somebody else because maybe there's not a lot of new customers out there. That's going to make any kind of innovative market moves a little bit riskier for a number one, whereas the number two has a bigger potential market. That's another way to think of it, right? If you've got 60% market share and the remaining 40% are spread out among 3 or 4 competitors, there's not a lot of new customers out there for you without having to steal them from somebody else. But if you're number two and there's a real dominant player in the market, most of your potential customers are the customers you're trying to take away from number one.
We've talked a lot about differentiation, authentication. So going back to that third part of your model, repudiation, what are some examples of brands that take that approach?
I think we'll have to figure that one out together. Although this is the one that I thought maybe we could think of in terms of a blue ocean strategy. So there's lots of examples of blue ocean brand strategies. One of the things that I wanted to come back to that we were talking about earlier is that I learned when researching this Avis campaign. I was familiar with the campaign, not as familiar with the history of the company. Avis actually comes into the world as a blue ocean entrant in my way of thinking. Now, we didn't have that language back then. I've not seen Avis discussed in any of the blue ocean literature. So this could be an interesting contribution that we make if we agree that it makes sense to explore Avis as a blue ocean company in the 1930s when no such strategy had been identified yet. So Hertz had all their rental counters in big city downtowns. That's interesting. That makes sense to us now, right? Because we live in suburbia and America is heavily suburbanized, which means like the car is sort of central to all of your daily activities. Back then, cars were relatively new, a few decades old, and urban consumers may have been a little bit less likely to own them, especially if we're talking about places like New York and Chicago that still had pretty good public transportation systems. And probably even back then, like New York was a pretty miserable place to drive in, even in the 1930s, if I had to guess. In the 1920s, you were dodging horses and carriages still too, right? So kind of makes sense, right? When this industry is new, maybe the car is for the urban city dweller to get the hell out of town on the weekend, right? Well, Avis comes along, and as commercial air travel is taking off, and they start putting rental cars at airports. That's brilliant. And maybe one of the reasons why they're stuck at 30% market share as of 1962 is that they can't compete with Hertz entrenched presence in urban centers. But maybe in 1962, I don't know, kind of just speculating here, that the business customer, the air traveler business customer, is not a big enough market to compete with the urban city dweller trying to get out of town. What is happening, though, is Hertz and other new entrants to that market are figuring out that Avis is onto something, and they're coming into the airport terminals too. So the competition is a little bit stiffer in those airport terminals than it is in these urban city centers where Hertz has this long established market presence. So just kind of a little bit of an interesting historical fact that I turned up, that maybe it's sort of in the DNA of Avis to really kind of go their own way.
I like that. It's like they had to try harder to figure out how they could serve the public without getting into the saturated market. So yeah.
So what do you think? Companies that have dealt with number two by just walking away, blazing a new path, opening up a new market segment, finding new consumers. There's lots of different ways that you can do this without having to go head to head with number one.
Yeah, absolutely. Sometimes I think it's, how do you define who your competition is?
Yeah.
Let's say you're a, whatever you want to call these, meat alternative, not necessarily veggie burgers, but Beyond Meat, Impossible Burgers, the fake meat. So if you're a fake meat company,
which I'm a big fan of, by the way, I just want.
Oh, me too. I love that stuff. But who's your competition?
Yeah.
Is it hamburger companies like selling actual beef? If that's the case, then maybe it is going to be more of an uphill climb when you're going against McDonald's and Burger King, and just you're really going up against a whole culture. But if you're creating a completely different product, then you just have to say, okay, that's not our competition. Then there's a bit more of a blue ocean. Of course, now there's more companies like that, so it's a little more easily defined. But in the early days, when those things were just starting out, it's like, okay, we're not going up against beef. Maybe we're going against veggie burgers, but really we're doing something completely different here.
I think this is fascinating. And I actually think that what's happening here is maybe the opposite of how we would typically think of a blue ocean strategy. Here's what I'm thinking. Maybe it comes back to this idea that at least if you're number two, you have a bigger potential market, right? And if you're number one and you already have 70% market share, there's only so many customers out there that you can recruit or steal away. If you're Beyond Meat, and depending on how we define the market, you have 2% market share. You have a huge potential market. I actually think this has a lot to do with the innovativeness of companies like Impossible and Beyond Meat. Maybe it is a blue ocean strategy, but sort of a radically different way of thinking about it than we would typically think about the classic examples of Yellowtail Wine or Southwest Airlines, or the two that often come to mind for me. It's this: vegetarian foods are a tiny sliver of the packaged foods market. So I've been eating veggie burgers for a long time, sort of ambivalently, because, Boca and what's the other big one?
Oh, Morningstar?
Morningstar, yeah, the black bean burgers, the Boca burgers. Ate those for years, just sort of ambivalently. They're okay.
Yeah.
I miss meat. They're not as good. They're good enough, right?
Right.
It's a tiny, the alternative foods market is just a tiny sliver of like consumer packaged foods overall, right? So maybe what's brilliant about these companies like Beyond and Impossible is they said, those are our customers, but we're not going to compete in that segment. We're going to compete with big meat. It's a tiny market segment. So we can swim with the sharks in this pond, right?
Yeah.
Or we can just dive into the massive ocean of meat eaters and try to capitalize on the potential market, right? Not the existing market, but the potential market for alternative meat products, right?
I see what you're saying.
I would argue that the potential market for Beyond and Impossible products is not the sort of die-hard 1960s era vegetarian that grew up eating Boca and Morningstar in the 1980s and 90s, right?
Yeah.
They're the meat eaters, right? That's where the market is. In fact, I don't know if you remember, but there was a big conversation about the beef industry in particular, they didn't want the government, the FDA, to allow Beyond and Impossible to place their products in the meat section of the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
Right? If you want Boca or Morningstar, there's a little alternative food section somewhere, or it's going to be in the freezer, right?
Yeah.
Well, guess where Impossible and Beyond are? Right next to the beef on the meat aisle.
Yeah. And I think the dairy industry had a similar issue with alternative milks using the word milk. They're like, no, you're not milk at all. So don't, yeah, the definition of what your product is like plays a big role too. But yeah, I see what you're saying. Beyond Meat, Impossible, those companies are kind of like in between, and it's almost like they get to choose who their competitor is going to be because they've come up with such an innovative product. Like, are they going to go after the vegetarians who kind of miss the taste of meat, or are they going to go after the beef eaters who would for years say, oh, well, I would like to try vegetarian options, but they taste like crap. I like the taste of meat and I can't get rid of that. So yeah, so it's really up to them who their main competition is, which is a great place to be.
And maybe they did their market research and they figured this out anecdotally. My wife's a lifelong vegetarian. Other friends who are diehard vegetarian. I'm like a sometimes not super serious vegetarian who's more concerned with like health and sustainability issues than like animal welfare per se.
Yeah.
Not that I don't care about it. It's just, for me, not the primary reason why I eat primarily vegetarian. The really hardcore vegetarians I know, that's their number one, right? It's the animal welfare issue above and beyond everything else. And those people that I know don't like these products because they taste too much like meat and it grosses them out.
Okay.
So that's interesting. Maybe these companies, they did their market research. They figured that out. They said,
I'm sure they did.
Our customers are, sort of meat adjacent.
Meat adjacent. I like that. All right. Well, Ian, as we wrap up, let's hit one more that brand or band that we wanted to talk about. Megadeth. Now, quick backstory. Metallica, their original lead guitarist was Dave Mustaine.
Yeah.
He was with them for a very brief time before he was unceremoniously kicked out of the band. And then he quickly started his own band, another thrash metal band called Megadeth, which became, I would say, the number 2 thrash metal band of the 80s, right? Metallica number 1. And then Metallica in 1991 put out the Black Album with Enter Sandman and Nothing Else Matters. And they just became megastars. Megadeth continued, and they still both bands continue to this day, but Metallica is definitely a lot bigger. And Megadeth's singer guitarist Dave Mustaine, I think it was in the movie Some Kind of Monster when he was confronting the guys that fired him decades before, and he's like, no matter how successful my band is, I will always be number 2 to you guys, and that drives me crazy. And and it's unfortunate. You ask any metal fan, like, hey, would you love to be the lead singer and guitarist of Megadeth? I'm like, hell yeah, that would be awesome. You have tons of fans, you're rich and you're famous, and you've got this huge body of work that people love. But for Mustaine, it just always ate him up inside that he was number 2. I feel like, maybe business owners who have a 2nd-Place brand, maybe they can learn a lesson from that. Of course, you want to try to be the best. You should always be trying to be number 1. But if you're not, if for some reason you're in 2nd place, is it really that bad? And it just seems like Mustaine's, a lot of people don't like him actually as a person, and for various reasons. But I think one is that, like, hey, come on, man, get over it. Be happy with what you've achieved. Maybe Megadeth they wouldn't be number 1, but they'd be even better if he would just, accept where he is. What do you think about that?
I think you're dead on, but I also have a little bit of a different take. I think this is a great example of the authenticity strategy, right? If you ask a truly self-respecting metalhead, you know, who was the better thrash metal band? The real diehards will tell you it's Megadeth. The real diehards, right?
Yep.
Though, especially after the Black Album came out and Metallica became merely a rock and roll band, right?
Yep.
Go listen to Rust in Peace, which came out around the same time as the Black Album, and that is just as much of a thrash metal album as their very first one was. So as Metallica sort of embraced their number one status and became more and more of a brand to more and more people, Megadeth kind of stayed true to the thrash metal formula, is still making music today that sounds a lot like the music they were making in the 1980s. So maybe part of the lesson here is number two, in what capacity, right? Number two is to say that number one is better, but maybe you're number two because you're better, just like Avis, right? We're number two because we never sold out like Metallica did, right?
Yeah.
It's true to our thrash metal roots. It's a smaller market, but it's a diehard market. It's a loyal market, right? If you go to a Metallica show, there's going to be lots of 14-year-olds there. If you go to a Megadeth show, I'm sorry to say, because I've been a couple times, it's, you know, we're the youngest guys at the show, right?
Right. It's the old timers. Oh, this is when metal was metal.
Yeah. But I think that it sort of makes sense if you look at why Metallica kicked Dave Mustaine out of the band. He was kind of the bad guy in the band, right? He was the drunk. He was like the rageaholic. And he sort of embraced that about his identity. And it happens to be a pretty good fit for how his band is positioned in the thrash metal market space, right?
Well, good. I that's a great take on it. And I think that's a great place to end it. I really appreciate you coming back on, Ian. This was a fun conversation.
Yeah, and you're going to have to close with some Megadeth, I think, when you.
I think so. I mean, yeah. See if I can get around the copyright to that. All right, great. Well, thanks for coming back on Brand Outlaw. And am I right that next time we do this, you may be coming to us from a different country?
Oh, you want me to zoom in from Austria? Okay, we can talk about that. I can collect some notes on what the big brands in Austria are. We'll be doing a case analysis on Red Bull, which is probably the greatest marketing success story to come out of the country of Austria.
There we go. All right. Well, we already got a topic for next time.